The matte black Lamborghini drifted into the cobblestone driveway of the Gangnam estate exactly 4 hours earlier than scheduled. Park Si-won killed the headlights, letting the engine's purr die into the bitter soul frost. He sat for a moment in the plush leather interior, adjusting the heavy platinum watch on his wrist. It was their anniversary, and he had come to surprise Hanul with a rare blue diamond, a symbol of the order and legacy he had spent a lifetime of blood to build. But as he stepped into the foyer, the silence felt wrong, too heavy, too artificial. The house was glowing with a warmth that shouldn't be there on a night his wife claimed she'd be at her mother's. He ascended the marble staircase, his polished Oxfords making no sound against the silk rug. That's when the audio shifted. A low, masculine chuckle, followed by Hanul's sharp, breathless giggle leaking through the heavy oak doors of the master suite. Si-won's jaw tightened. His hand instinctively went to the custom Beretta at his hip. He was a man who solved problems with lead. But before he could kick the door into the wall, a firm, warm hand caught his forearm from the pitch-black shadows of the servants' corridor. "Sir, please," a voice whispered, thick with urgency and a hint of a Nigerian accent. It was Amarachi, the head chef who usually stayed invisible in the kitchen. Her dark eyes were wide, reflecting the hallway's dim light. "Please don't go in there. It's a trap, and you aren't the only one with a gun tonight." In that frozen second, the most feared man in Korea did the one thing his ego usually forbade. He stopped, and he listened. Welcome to Afro-Korean love thrillers, the home of dark romance, brutal betrayals, forbidden passion, and revenge that cuts deep. From tender romance to intense drama, from heartbreak to healing, every story pulls you into a world where love crosses borders and challenges expectations. If you love stories where powerful men fall for the one woman they were never supposed to love, and vice versa, where enemies become lovers, and where every choice has a deadly consequence, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this channel, because we will always bring you heart-pounding Mafia love stories that will keep you hooked till the very last word. Now sit back, because this story is about to blow your mind. Now, let's get back to our story. Si-won's breath hitched in the hollow of his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged beast. He looked at Amarachi's hand on his arm, a breach of protocol that would have normally cost a servant their position, but the raw desperation in her gaze anchored him. Slowly, he lowered the Beretta. The laughter behind the door continued, oblivious and cruel. Amarachi didn't let go. She gestured toward the back service stairs, her movements fluid and ghostly. "Follow me, sir," she breathed. "The walls have ears, but the cold room does not." He followed her into the industrial kitchen, a place of stainless steel and shadows that smelled of rosemary and expensive cognac. Amarachi didn't head for the stoves. Instead, she reached behind a heavy mahogany wine rack and pulled out a sleek, obsidian-colored tablet. When the screen flickered to life, the blue light cast sharp, jagged shadows across her high cheekbones. "I am a chef, Mr. Park," she said, her voice steadying. "In my kitchen, I must see everything. If a spice is missing, I know. If a blade is dull, I feel it. 6 months ago, the salt in this house changed. It became bitter." She swiped her finger across the glass. A grid of high-definition security feeds appeared, but these weren't from the mansion's official system. They were angled from smoke detectors, picture frames, and bookshelves. The Madame Hanel had the main system looped. She thought I was just a girl from Lagos who only knew how to make sumptuous meals. She didn't realize I was an engineer before I was a cook. The first video played. It was dated 4 months ago. There, in the very kitchen they stood in, Hanel was draped over Junso, Si-won's most trusted partner. They weren't just touching, they were laughing at a ledger, Si-won's ledger. "It's not just the bed, sir," Amarachi whispered, her eyes fixed on the screen. "They've been documenting your shipments, your port codes, and your offshore keys. She's been feeding you your life's work, spoonful by spoonful. Every time I tried to speak, she threatened to have my family's visas revoked. She called me the help. She forgot that the help sees the poison before it's served." Siwon watched the woman he loved whisper secrets into the ear of the man he called brother. The betrayal was a physical weight, crushing the air out of his lungs. He looked at the folder of files Amarachi had meticulously organized, dates, times, and transcribed conversations of their plan to liquidate him during the anniversary gala. The Mafia boss looked at the chef. For years he had seen her as a tool of his comfort. Now he saw her as his only lifeline. The arrogance that had blinded him evaporated, replaced by a cold, lethal clarity. "Why tell me now, Amarachi?" he asked, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "Because a king should die in battle, not in his sleep, by the hand of a snake." Siwon took the tablet, his fingers brushing hers. The alliance was sealed in the dark. He wasn't going to kill them tonight. He was going to let them think they had won, right until the moment he took the world from beneath their feet. The silence of the kitchen was broken only by the hum of the industrial refrigerator, a sound that felt like a ticking clock. Siwon took the tablet from Amarachi, his grip so tight the plastic casing groaned. He looked back toward the service stairs, his eyes shifting from the digital evidence to the physical reality waiting for him at the top of those steps. "Stay here," he commanded, though the ice in his voice was no longer directed at her. He moved back into the shadows of the hallway, a wraith in a black cashmere coat. He didn't use the main entrance this time. He knew the house's architecture, every secret hinge and muffled floorboard. He reached the master suite through a hidden valet door used for delivering dry cleaning. He pressed his face to the narrow gap in the paneling, the wood grain cold against his skin. The room was bathed in the amber glow of expensive candles. On the king-sized bed lay his anniversary gift to Hanel, a silk robe he'd sent ahead of his arrival. But she wasn't alone. Hanel was draped across the pillows, her head thrown back in a laugh that sounded like shattered glass. And sitting on the edge of the bed, his hand resting familiarly on her knee, was Junso. Siwon's lungs burned. Junso wasn't just his second in command. He was the man Siwon had pulled from the gutters of Busan 20 years ago. They had bled together. They had built the Park Empire on a foundation of brotherhood. "He's late," Hanel murmured, her voice dripping with a predatory sweetness Siwon had never heard before. The flight from Jeju shouldn't have been delayed this long. "The longer he's in the air, the more time we have to finalize the transfer," Junso replied, his voice calm, calculating. He pulled a silver lighter from his pocket, the one Siwon had given him for his birthday, and flicked it open. By the time his feet touch the tarmac, the board will have already voted. He won't be a boss anymore. He'll just be a man with a lot of enemies and no payroll to protect him. Hanel leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a wicked hunger. And then? Junso smiled, a thin, serpentine expression. And then the king has an unfortunate accident on the drive home, a tragic end for a man who lived too long by the sword. Through the crack in the door, Siwon watched them toast to his death with his own 20-year-old whiskey. The blue diamond in his pocket felt like a searing coal. He had been blind, wrapped in the arrogance of his own power, believing that fear bought loyalty. He had ignored the quiet girl in the kitchen who saw the truth and embraced the vipers who shared his bed and his board. He backed away from the door, his heart transitioning from the heat of rage to the absolute zero of a planned execution. He didn't need the Beretta tonight. To kill them now would be too quick, too merciful. He descended the stairs and found Amarachi waiting exactly where he had left her. She looked at his face and knew the transition was complete.
"We are leaving," Siwon whispered. "Pack nothing that identifies you. From this moment, you don't work for this house. You work for me."
The cold air of the kitchen felt like a tonic against Siwon's feverish rage. He looked at Amarachi, the woman who had just shattered his reality and handed him the pieces, and for the first time he saw the tactical mind behind the quiet demeanor. "The back gate," Amarachi whispered, her eyes darting toward the security monitors. "The sensors on the perimeter are patched into Junseo's personal phone. If we trip them, he'll know you're here before you reach the street." She didn't grab a suitcase. Instead, she reached into the hollow of a decorative floor vase and pulled out a set of keys and a burner phone. "I've had a car waiting 2 blocks away for weeks. I knew this night was coming, sir. I just didn't know if you'd be the one walking out or if they'd be carrying you out." They moved through the servants' entrance, the heavy steel door clicking shut with a finality that signaled the end of Park Si-won's reign as the public face of the syndicate. They navigated the narrow, frozen alleyways of the estate, shadows moving within shadows. Si-won felt the weight of the blue diamond in his pocket, a multi-million-dollar piece of carbon that was now utterly worthless compared to the plastic tablet tucked under Amarachi's arm. As they reached a nondescript gray sedan parked under a flickering streetlight, Si-won stopped. He looked back at the glowing windows of his mansion. Up there, in the golden light, his brother and his wife were still toasted to his ghost. "Let them have the house," Si-won said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of cold fury. "They've won the bricks and the mortar, but they've lost the blood." He climbed into the passenger seat, allowing Amarachi to take the wheel. It was a staggering subversion of his entire life, the billionaire mafia boss being driven into the night by his cook. As she pulled away from the curb, he didn't look back. "Where are we going?" he asked. "To a place Junseo doesn't know exists," she replied, her hands steady on the wheel. "My brother owns a warehouse in the shipping district. It's loud, it's dirty, and it's completely invisible to men who only look at penthouses." The drive was silent, the neon lights of Seoul blurring into streaks of electric blue and predatory red. Si-won watched Amarachi's reflection in the window. She was calm, focused, a soldier who had been behind enemy lines for far too long. He realized then that his greatest flaw hadn't been his temper or his greed, it was his choice of company. He had surrounded himself with mirrors that reflected his own ego, while the only person with eyes for the truth had been relegated to the kitchen. "Amarachi," he said as they crossed the Han River, "when we get there, I need a list. Every name, every bank, every port official Junseo has spoken to in the last 6 months." She nodded. A small, grim smile touched her lips. "I already have the list, sir, and I have the passwords to the accounts they think they've emptied. We aren't just leaving, we're taking the floor out from under them." The warehouse was a cavernous skeleton of rusted steel and salt-crusted concrete, tucked away in the industrial guts of the Incheon docks. It smelled of sea air, diesel, and old secrets. Amarachi led him through a maze of shipping containers to a small, fortified office in the back, lit by the clinical hum of overhead fluorescent lights. Si-won sat on a plastic crate, the billion-dollar tycoon stripped of his throne, while Amarachi began to work. She didn't ask for instructions, she simply moved. Within minutes, she had laid out 3 different burner phones, the tablet, and a map of Seoul's financial district. "Tomorrow night is the anniversary gala," Si-won said, his eyes fixed on the map. "Junseo expects me to walk into that ballroom, make a speech, and then disappear in a tragic accident. He thinks he has cleared the board." "Then let's give him a dinner he'll never forget," Amarachi replied, her voice dropping into a tone of chilling pragmatism. "He knows you are a man of habit, sir. He expects you to call him tomorrow morning, acting as if you just landed. If you don't, he'll flee before we can trap him." Si-won leaned forward, the shadows under his eyes making him look like a vengeful god.
We play the game. I call him. I tell him the Jeju deal was a success. I tell him I want a private celebration before the gala. Just the three of us. My wife, my brother, and me. At the mansion. And the food? Amarachi asked. He knows I am the only one who prepares your private meals. You will return to the mansion at dawn. Act as if nothing happened. Act as if you never saw me tonight. You will prepare the anniversary feast. But you aren't cooking for a celebration, Amarachi. You are cooking for a funeral. The plan was a masterclass in psychological warfare. While Amarachi played the role of the submissive chef back at the estate, Si-Huan would spend the day in this cold warehouse, using the offshore keys Amarachi had recovered to silently drain the shadow accounts Junseo had worked so hard to fill. I will prepare the ogugut, the last meal for the dead, Amarachi whispered, the tradition of her new home blending with the iron will of her heritage. I will season it with the truth. By the time they realize the wine is bitter, it will be too late for them to run. Si-Huan looked at her, truly seeing the woman who had lived in his house for months as a ghost. He realized she wasn't just his cook, she was his strategist. She was the only person who hadn't tried to take a piece of his soul. When this is over, Amarachi, Si-Huan said softly, you will never have to stand in a kitchen again unless you choose to. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable but firm. I don't mind the heat, Mr. Park. I just prefer to know whom I'm feeding. As the sun began to bleed over the Incheon horizon, Amarachi stood to leave. The trap was set. The poisoned table was ready. Si-Huan picked up the burner phone to make the call that would seal his traitor's fate, his voice as smooth as silk and as cold as a grave. The dial tone was a rhythmic pulse in the silence of the warehouse, a heartbeat before the kill. When the line clicked open, Si-Huan's face transformed. The cold, lethal mask dissolved into a voice of warm, weary triumph, the perfect performance of a man who suspected nothing. Junseo, Si-Huan said, leaning back against the rusted desk, the Jeju deal is signed. It was a bloodbath, but we own the ports now. I'm heading to the airport in 20 minutes. On the other end of the line, there was a fractional pause, the sound of a traitor catching his breath. That's incredible news, brother, Junseo replied, his voice smoothing into its usual oily charm. Hanul will be thrilled. We were starting to worry. I want a private dinner before the gala tonight, Si-Huan said, his eyes locked on Amarachi, who stood by the door. Just the inner circle. Tell Hanul to have Amarachi prepare the vintage cognac. I'll see you at 7. He hung up and immediately turned to the tablet. Do it, he whispered. While Amarachi drove back to the mansion to play her role as the dutiful chef, Si-Huan initiated the financial sting. For months, Junseo and Hanul had been siphoning funds into a shell company called Apex Holdings, thinking they were clever. They didn't know that Amarachi had tracked the digital crumbs back to a private server in Switzerland. With a few keystrokes, Si-Huan didn't just freeze the accounts, he redirected them. He watched the digital ledger on the screen. $40 million, $120 million, $300 million. The lifeblood of Junseo's planned coup was being sucked out in real time, flowing into a new account that only Si-Huan and Amarachi could access. By noon, the panic started. Through the bug Amarachi had planted in the mansion's study, Si-Huan listened to the chaos, the sound of a glass shattering, Hanul's voice high and shrill. What do you mean the balance is 0? That's impossible. Check the backup. The backup is gone, Hanul. Junseo's voice was ragged, stripped of its composure. If we don't have that liquidity by the gala, the board will have my head. I promised them the buyout tonight. Siwon sat in the dim light of the warehouse, a ghost haunting his own life. He listened to them turn on each other, the seductive wife and the sneaky partner, devouring one another as their greed turned to terror. They thought they were the predators, but they were merely rats in a flooded cellar. He looked at the burner phone. One message from Amarachi. The table is set. The cognac is poured. The billionaire Mafia boss stood up, adjusted his black cashmere coat, and checked the Beretta. The financial sting was over. Now it was time for the physical reckoning.
Siwon entered the mansion through the basement tunnel, a route known only to him and the architect who had met a silent end years ago. The house was a pressure cooker of invisible tension. Upstairs, he could hear the muffled, frantic pacing of Junseo, but downstairs, in the heart of the kitchen, there was only the rhythmic, steady chop of a knife against a wooden board. He stepped into the light, and Amarachi didn't flinch. She continued to slice thin ribbons of scallion, her movements a meditative contrast to the treachery rotting the floorboards above them. The room was filled with the rich, complex aroma of jimdok, simmering soy, ginger, and dried chilies. It was a scent of comfort, a scent of home, and yet, tonight, it was a veil. "They are unraveling," Siwon said, his voice a low vibration in the humid air. "Fear has a distinct smell, Mr. Park," Amarachi replied, finally setting the knife down. "It's sharper than the vinegar, more pungent than the garlic. They've spent the last hour accusing each other of the theft. They are so busy looking for a ghost in the machine that they've forgotten to look at the woman standing right in front of them." She walked over to a small burner where a pot of tea was steeping. Not the expensive imported leaves Hanel demanded, but a dark, earthy brew from her own private stock. She poured a cup and handed it to him. "Drink this. Your heart is beating too fast for a man who needs a steady hand." Siwon took the cup. The warmth seeped into his palms, grounding him. He looked at her, really looked at her. For years he had lived in a world of transactional loyalty, where every smile was bought and every bow was a calculated move. But this woman had nothing to gain and everything to lose by standing beside a falling king. "You could have taken that money and disappeared, Amarachi," he said softly. "With the codes you had, you could have been halfway to Europe before I even realized the accounts were empty. Why stay?" Amarachi leaned against the stainless steel counter, her gaze unwavering. "In my village, we say that a person who eats alone chokes alone. You were a man surrounded by many people, yet you were eating alone every night. I didn't stay for the mafia boss, Siwon. I stayed for the man who always said thank you for the soup, even when his mind was 1,000 miles away. Integrity isn't found in a crown, it's found in the silence between the storms." For a moment, the heavy mantle of his title fell away. In the steam-filled kitchen, they weren't master and servant, or boss and chef. They were two souls tethered by a truth that no one else in the world understood. Siwon felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in decades: peace. "Tonight," Siwon said, "they will realize that the help they ignored is the very hand that guided the blade." Amarachi nodded, picking up the tray of cognac. "The table is ready. Go upstairs, sir. Put on your mask. I will be right behind you with the final course." The dining room was a cathedral of cold gold and hollow luxury. Park Si-won sat at the head of the table, the blue diamond he had intended for Ha-Nul sitting in the center of the silk runner like a funeral pyre. Across from him, his wife and his partner sat like statues of salt, their faces pale under the crystal chandelier. The air was thick with the scent of the Ogu Gut feast Amarachi had prepared. It was a beautiful spread, but to Junseo and Ha-Nul, it looked like a final meal. "You're quiet tonight," Siwon said, his voice as smooth as the vintage cognac in his glass. "Is the food not to your liking?" Amarachi took special care with the spices. Junseo wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his hands trembling as he reached for his glass. "The food is excellent, brother. It's just the market. The volatility today has been
distracting. Volatility, Siwon repeated, swirling the amber liquid. A polite word for theft, or perhaps betrayal. Hanul's fork clattered against her porcelain plate. Siwon, darling, you're being dramatic. It's our anniversary. Let's not talk about work. I'm not talking about work, Hanul. I'm talking about legacy, Siwon said, his eyes finally locking onto hers. The warmth was gone, replaced by a terrifying abyssal black. I'm talking about how my second-in-command and my wife thought they could hollow out my empire while I was in the air. I'm talking about the $40 million that vanished from Apex Holdings at noon today. Junseo stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the marble. Siwon, I can explain. Sit down, Siwon commanded. The weight of his voice was a physical blow. Junseo collapsed back into his seat. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The mansion plunged into a suffocating darkness. The power? Hanul shrieked, her voice thin and sharp. In the shadows, the heavy double doors of the dining room groaned open. A silhouette stood there framed by the moonlight spilling from the hallway. It was Amarachi, but she wasn't carrying a tray. She was holding a tactical tablet, the screen glowing with the green lines of a live security feed. The perimeter is breached, but it's not the police. Junseo, your private hit squad is at the gate. It seems they realized your accounts were empty and decided to collect their payment in blood. Junseo's face went white. No, they wouldn't. I told them to wait for my signal. Your signal was supposed to be the toast at the gala, but there is no gala. There is no money. And in precisely 30 seconds, this room will become a kill zone. The only question is, who dies first? A heavy crash echoed from the foyer downstairs, the sound of the front door being kicked off its hinges. The ambush had begun, but not the one Junseo had planned. He had invited wolves to the door, and now he had no meat to feed them. Amarachi, Siwon whispered into the dark, take the passage now.
The sound of shattering glass and the heavy thud of tactical boots echoed from the grand staircase. Junseo's mercenaries, realizing their payday had evaporated with the frozen accounts, were no longer coming for a coordinated coup. They were coming to tear the house down. This way, now! Amarachi's voice was a whip crack in the dark. She grabbed Siwon's hand, her grip calloused and steady, and pulled him toward what looked like a seamless wood-paneled wall behind the sideboard. She pressed a hidden catch disguised as a knobby grain in the oak. The panel hissed open, revealing a narrow, lightless stone corridor that smelled of damp earth and old insulation. How do you know about this? Siwon hissed as they slipped inside, the panel clicking shut just as a burst of submachine gun fire shredded the dining room table they had occupied seconds ago. I told you, Mr. Park, I see the poison before it's served, she whispered, her breath ghosting against his ear. I spent my first month here mapping the bones of this place. I don't like being trapped. They moved through the veins of the mansion, through narrow slats in the walls. Siwon saw flashes of the chaos outside. He watched through a vent as Junseo scrambled under the piano, screaming into a dead phone, while Hanel cowered behind a sofa, her silk anniversary robe torn and stained. The men Siwon had trusted were being hunted by the monsters they had hired. The passage sloped downward, leading them toward the foundations. Amarachi moved with an uncanny memory of the turns. When they reached a heavy iron grate, she didn't push it. She pulled a lever that bypassed the mansion's electronic locks Junseo would have surely used to cage them. The garage is blocked, Amarachi said, checking her glowing tablet. They have 3 shooters covering the exits, but the wine cellar has a ventilation shaft that leads to the old drainage canal. It's tight, it's filthy, and it hasn't been used in 50 years. Lead the way, Siwon said. He looked at the woman in the chef's whites, now smudged with soot and dust. She was standing between the most powerful man in Seoul and certain death, and she hadn't hesitated once. They emerged into the damp air of the canal just as a muffled explosion rocked the earth above them. The mansion, his legacy, his pride, was burning. Siwon stood in the mud of the drainage ditch, the orange glow of the fire reflecting in his eyes. He looked at his hands. They were empty. The blue diamond was gone, lost in the scramble. His empire was in ashes. But as he looked at Amarachi, who was already scanning the horizon for their escape vehicle, he realized he had never felt more powerful. "They think I'm dead," Siwon murmured. "Let them," Amarachi replied, handing him a fresh jacket she had stashed in the canal mouth. "Dead men don't have to follow the rules, and dead men are very good at taking what belongs to them." The fire from the mansion painted the night sky a bruised purple as Siwon and Amarachi reached a nondescript shipping container on the edge of the Han River. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cheap cigarettes and motor oil. 7 men stood as Siwon entered. These weren't the polished lieutenants Junseo kept in the penthouses. These were the tunnel rats, the street-level enforcers who managed the docks and the construction sites. Men with scarred knuckles and grease under their fingernails. Men Junseo had called disposable. "Boss," one of them whispered, his voice a mix of shock and reverence. They had heard the mansion was a tomb. Junseo thought he could buy the hierarchy, Siwon said, his voice cutting through the damp air like a serrated blade. He thought the head could live without the body. He was wrong. The body is here, and the body is hungry. Amarachi stepped forward, opening the tablet. She didn't wait for permission. She bypassed the syndicate's encrypted firewall and began flashing photos onto a cracked monitor. It was the evidence of Junseo's secret meetings with rival families and the digital trail of the stolen millions. "The money didn't disappear," she told the men, her Nigerian accent standing out like a sharp melody in the grimy room. "Mr. Park moved it. Every won that was supposed to pay Junseo's mercenaries is now sitting in a trust for the families of the men in this room, but only if the trash is cleared out by dawn." A low, hungry rumble grew among the soldiers. They had been treated like dirt by Junseo's inner circle for years. Now their true king was back from the dead, and he was offering them a kingdom. "I want the ports locked down," Siwon commanded. "I want the safe houses raided. Junseo will try to flee to the airport. Don't let him. I want him brought to the warehouse in Incheon, alive. As for my wife," he paused, the coldness in his heart reaching an absolute zero. "Bring her too. She wanted a life of excitement. I'm going to give her a front-row seat to the end of the world." The men vanished into the night, a silent army of ghosts. Siwon turned to Amarachi, who was still monitoring the police scanners. "You didn't have to tell them about the money being for their families," Siwon noted. "Men will die for a boss, Siwon," she said, using his name for the first time without a title, "but they will kill for their children. I gave them a reason to be more than just soldiers." Siwon looked at the smoke rising in the distance. The Mafia's wrath wasn't just about fire and blood anymore. It was about precision. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one holding the compass. She was. The Incheon warehouse was a tomb of rusted iron, illuminated only by a single flickering bulb swinging from the ceiling. In the center of the room, tied to 2 heavy wooden chairs, sat the wreckage of Park Siwon's former life. Junseo's face was a map of bruises, his expensive silk shirt torn and stained with the grime of the docks. Beside him, Hanul looked like a ghost, her mascara running in jagged black lines down her cheeks, her anniversary robe a tattered rag. The heavy sliding door of the warehouse groaned open. Siwon walked in, his footsteps measured and heavy. Behind him, Amarachi followed, her presence silent and watchful, the shadow that had become his light. "Siwon, please!" Hanul shrieked, her voice cracking. "He forced me. Junseo threatened to kill me if I didn't help him. I did it for you." Siwon didn't look at her. He stopped in front of Junso, who was staring at the floor, the realization of his failure finally sinking in. 20 years, Siwon said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. I gave you a name. I gave you a seat at my table. I gave you my trust. You gave me crumbs, Junso spat, finally looking up, his eyes wild with a desperate, cornered hate. You sat on your throne and let me do the dirty work. I built this empire while you played the billionaire. It was mine by right. And yet, Siwon said, leaning in close, the man who built the empire couldn't even see the cook in his own kitchen. You lost, Junso, because you were so busy looking at the crown that you forgot to watch the people who actually move the pieces. Siwon pulled the blue diamond from his pocket, the one Amarachi had recovered from the dining room floor before they fled. He held it up to the light, then let it drop. It clattered on the concrete, rolling into the shadows. I'm not going to kill you, Siwon said. The statement hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Hanul let out a sob of relief, but Junso's eyes widened with a deeper terror. He knew Siwon. To kill you is to give you an end, Siwon continued, but I prefer you to have a legacy. I've already sent the video Amarachi recorded to the other families. They know you stole from the communal ports. They know you're the reason their shipments were seized last month. Siwon turned to Amarachi, and for the first time, he smiled, a cold, genuine expression. And as for Hanul, her mother's villa, her accounts, her charity foundations, they've all been liquidated. Every won has been transferred to a scholarship fund in Amarachi's home village. You're not just broke, Hanul. You're invisible. He signaled to the tunnel rats standing in the shadows. Untie them. Put them on a boat to the outskirts of the city. No money, no phones, no names. Let the street decide their worth. As the traders were dragged out, screaming and begging, the warehouse returned to silence. Siwon stood in the vast, empty space, a man who had lost everything but gained the world.
The silence following the departure of the traders was not empty. It was heavy with the beginning of something new. Siwon stood amidst the rusted iron of the warehouse, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Not the jagged pace of a man under threat, but the steady beat of a man who had finally cleared the air. He turned to Amarachi. She was leaning against a steel pillar, the blue light of her tablet still illuminating her face. She looked exhausted, but her gaze was as sharp as the day she had first stepped into his kitchen. For the first time, Siwon didn't see a servant, a chef, or even a strategist. He saw the only person who had ever looked at him without wanting a piece of his throne. You saved my life twice tonight, Siwon said, walking toward her. Once from a bullet and once from a lie. I told you, Siwon, her voice soft but firm. I didn't do it for the boss. I did it because the truth was being strangled in that house and I couldn't watch it die. Siwon reached out, his hand hesitating before gently touching her shoulder, the same place she had gripped him in the shadows to stop him from entering the bedroom. The mansion is gone. The hierarchy is broken. I have no title to give you and no gold that hasn't been touched by blood. Amarachi smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed her face. I never liked that gold anyway. It was too loud. In that moment, the billionaire who had spent his life buying loyalty realized that love was the only thing that couldn't be invoiced. He realized that the passion he had felt for Hanul was a performance, but the quiet, unshakable bond he felt with Amarachi was an anchor. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, and for the first time in his life, the most feared man in Seoul let his guard down. He wasn't falling into a trap. He was falling into a future.
A year later, the Seoul mansion remained a blackened shell, a monument to a dead era. But on the outskirts of the city, overlooking the rugged beauty of the coast, a new estate had risen. It wasn't a fortress of marble and silk, but a home of wood, stone, and light. The tunnel rats were no longer just enforcers. They were the backbone of a new kind of syndicate, a legitimate logistics empire that prioritized the families of the workers over the greed of the lieutenants. Siwon had traded his Beretta for a pen and his arrogance for a deep, abiding respect for the people who kept the world moving. In the heart of the new house was a kitchen that rivaled any in the world, but the woman who ran it was no longer the help. Amarachi sat at the head of the long oak table, a glass of wine in her hand, watching the sunset. She was the architect of this new life, the silent partner who had become the queen of a different kind of kingdom. As Siwon sat beside her, he took her hand. The blue diamond had never been found, but it didn't matter. He had found something much rarer in the December darkness of a betrayal, a partner who saw his soul before she saw his power. From the ashes of his old world, something unexpected had risen, a love built on the truth and an empire built to last.